Inflation of the economy during World War I caused lower-class families to suffer at the increase of food prices. Food shortages and rationing were a result of the many German U-boats lurking in the waters around Great Britain. Industry at this time switched to wartime goods and generally worked long hours to develop ammunition for the soldiers. In order to pay for the war, the government raised taxes as much as they could, but then had to rely on the people buying war bonds. This first picture depicts a ration card, very prevalent around Great Britain at the time of the food shortages. As men went off to war, women took up the jobs that the men usually had. This second picture depicts women as farmers. Women had to work in the fields to supplement the lack of imports coming in due to the German U-boats. When the war was declared, many men were excited to join the war efforts because they thought it would be over by Christmas. A rise in nationalism and the romantic attitude toward war saw many men volunteering to join the army. Propaganda was heavily used to influence people to join. However, after the Battle of the Marne, the British people realized this would not be a quick war. That, in conjunction with the horror stories of trench warfare, caused a decline in volunteers. The government turned to heavy conscription and use of more persuasive propaganda. This first picture is an example of the propaganda used to encourage people from other countries to join the war effort. This second picture depicts the Englishmen excited to go to war. Due to the fact that most men were away fighting in the war, women had to take on the jobs that men had traditionally held. The jobs included factory workers, agricultural workers, police officers, nurses, and communications workers. Women were also used in propaganda to encourage men to volunteer. The increase in working-class women led to advances in women's suffrage. This first picture shows women working as nurses, a job traditionally held by men. This second picture depicts a woman working in a munitions factory in Great Britain. The rise of women working in factories also led to the new fad of short hair.
Economically, the war cost Germany about $40 billion. During the war, their industrial output fell by 40% and they suffered from severe food shortages. 35% of all trade was moved to the black market, and they also experienced a shortage of raw materials, which can easily be attributed to the British blockade. Money essentially became useless after the war due to hyperinflation. And after the war, no one would trade with Germany or give them their ear for diplomatic measures because Germany was blamed for the war. The first picture depicts Germany's unemployment rate from 1920 to 1932. This shows the repercussions of the war that they suffered because of their defeat. The second picture depicts a housewife burning her money because of the hyperinflation in Germany after the war. The third picture depicts a little child playing with a large stack of money, also showing hyperinflation. And the fourth picture depicts the government as printing too much money, essentially giving them the blame for there being hyperinflation. Socially, the Germans felt cheated after the conclusion of the war. The Kaisers ended up taking the blame, and the people of Germany desired a new government. In post-war Germany, there's a large amount of suspicion surrounding the government and surrounding the aristocrats who were trying to gain influence. This led to a large amount of tension. However, during the war, food shortages caused by food being directed towards the soldiers led to people turning to radicalism. Strikes and civil unrest were also present due to the costs of the war and food shortages. These three pictures help depict Germany socially during the war. The picture on top represents civil unrest, the picture to the right also represents civil unrest, and the picture at the bottom represents food shortage. Gender roles in Germany were unique. Despite the percentage of women in the workplace rising to 37%, there was still a strong resistance by the German people to have women stay in the homes. Germany was not as open to gender equality as the UK and US. By the time that women were finally let into the workplace, it was at the end of the war, and it was too late to change anything. This picture simply illustrates Germany's losses after World War I. So the territory at the top was given to Denmark, the territory to the right was given to Poland, and the territory at the bottom left was given to France.
Before the war, France was experiencing economic growth due to industrialization, yet its economy was still largely agricultural, with large gold reserves and investments abroad. During the war, there was labor shortages due to conscriptions. Industry had to switch to make guns and ammunition, etc., which caused rationing of consumer goods. Also, there were food shortages as the war took place on France's arable land. France had to rely on imports and continued to do so after the war ended. After the war, France lost 2 million hectares of arable land, 1,000 miles of canals, 3,000 miles of railroads, and half the roads in the northeast, which crippled their economy. Furthermore, the economy was crushed as investments were stagnant abroad and inside the country, and German reparations did little to help. These pictures show the factories during the war and how the French's focus was on building wartime products. Before the war, France had one of the most liberal governments, yet French failure during the Franco-Prussian War caused the people to have a need to prove themselves. Plus, there was political instability due to the many changes in the government that swung back and forth between the left and the right. During the war, France had romantic ideas about the war. Yet as the war dragged on, and as public morale dropped, the government called a state of siege and took away many civil liberties. Yet as the end of 1917 had people believing the end of the war was near, due to military victories and the belief that France's victory was the only way the war would end. After the war, France lost 20% of its men between the ages of 20 to 40, creating a lost generation. On top of that, there was a change in political situation. The moderates were blamed for the war, and radicalism increased as unemployment and the gap between the rich and poor increased. Most people only wanted someone to listen to their needs. As a result, France was segmented into a group of people that wanted to nationalize industry and was against the military, and the conservatives. The first pictures show propaganda. The first one is to show that bread was gold, or to convince the public that farming was necessary. The second is to dehumanize the Germans and show them as monsters, to convince them that they were doing the right thing, to increase public morale. The third is to support food rationing, as it was highly necessary during the end of the war. And finally, the final picture is showing the destruction of France after the war and how their country was left in ruins. Like other European states, French women stepped up to fill the gaps left by men in the farms and factories. Women in the workplace increased from 17,000 to 557,000 by 1918. The strikes in France during 1917 were also caused mostly by women, as men were scared they would be called to the front, which shows that the women had influence over the economy. After the war, many women were left widowers and did receive pensions from the government, and there was a gender imbalance. Yet, women did have a feminist group, the French Union for Women's Rights, that had been active since 1905 and was pushing for suffrage. Yet the government pushed women's rights aside as they claimed they were more pressing matters. Really, they were scared that the church would gain influence over the government through the women, and that they would fear social unrest would occur. Women did not get the right to vote until 1945. These photos show that women worked both in the factories and the farms in roles traditionally male.
Some social similarities between Germany, France, and England include the use of mass conscription after they all realized the war was going to be longer than expected. Another similarity they shared was the use of propaganda to dehumanize the enemy and the romanticized views of going to war. Similarities between Germany and France include the change to radical views due to the widening gap between the rich and poor. Also, former soldiers for the German military were suspicious of their new government, which could lead to the potential threat of social order. Similarities between France and Germany were their views of women in society. They were not as quick to allow women in the workplace or grant them the right to vote. For example, France didn't allow women the right to vote until 1945. Germany only allowed women into the workplace right before the war ended, but still did not give in women suffrage. England differs because they granted women the right to vote if they were 30 or older. Even though gender equality between men and women were not fully met, England still progressed towards gender equality more than France and Germany. Women in England were also influential in propaganda and took over jobs in factories, farms, law enforcement, and communications. Likewise, French women filled the similar positions, but were not given the right to vote. Economically, England, France, and Germany had large debt after the war, suffered from inflation, and used rationing in order for manufactured goods to be sent to the soldiers. Germany differed because their food shortages were caused by English ships blockading their ports. France differed because they lost large amounts of farmland due to the war being fought on their land.
England differed in that they suffered damages caused by Zeppelins dropping bombs throughout the city and German U-boats sinking ships carrying supplies and resources.